Okay, perfect. So let's kick it off. So we'll talk about Google authentication. It's on purpose Google authentication and not just GCP authentication. GCP did a really good job of kind of taking the question of how to authenticate away from you. You start with GCP, it kind of just works. But then if you go a bit deeper, for example, you want to access other services, like Google Drive or Google Directory API to query your G Suite users, things start to break in your face, throw strange questions on you with mentioning terms that you never encountered before. So I've been through this journey during the last months, and I'm going to share my discoveries on the subject in hopes it will save you some time down the road. So quickly about me, my name is Zaar. I'm leading DoiT International Australia, and you can find me on LinkedIn, and we have a couple of open positions available. So if you're keen to join our team as a senior cloud architect, please contact me, or just apply on LinkedIn jobs. Okay, so back to the topic. So Google authentication, which GCP is part of, is based on OAuth 2.0. Just leaving my full screen, so I'll continue like that. So in the nutshell, I'm not going to go into the intricacies of OAuth 2. There is tons of documentation written on that. The thing is, there is certain authentication flow that's going on. You know, that login with Google button. And eventually after that flow, you end up with something that's called access token and scopes. Now, I'm sure you've seen access token before. There is a famous gcloud auth print auth token command that leaves you with some long string that you can go and append to certain curl commands later on to request from the APIs. But scopes is not something that's kind of visible. You know, you see the token, it does have scopes associated with it behind the scenes, but it's not something you clearly see, etc. But yeah, they are important. So in this talk, I'm going to mainly talk about scopes and why they matter, and maybe if there is a good interest, we'll have a part 2 of this talk later on. So the devil is in the scopes. And let's see why. So scopes actually part of OAuth 2 standard. So originally Google Cloud, they came, okay, let's use OAuth. It already has scopes. Maybe we can use them as some kind of, you know, access control list in a way. So scopes provide coarse access. So first thing, you have scopes, and then you have also, in case of GCP, you have IAM permissions, right? So you can have cloud platform scope, but then you need to have certain permissions to create a VM, which is a fine-grained thing. And you need to both to succeed. And this is where it becomes confusing, because you don't see scopes, but you see, but IAM permissions are there. You go to the console, you see them, and then you kind of say, okay, I have a permissions, but why I fail? My command failed with some weird error complaining about scopes, and what is scopes at all? So let's see how scopes enter the picture. So you want to bootstrap your development environment on your laptop, and you run gcloud auth login. It opens the browser and goes to the URL, very long URL. But among the other things, it actually tells which scopes you want to authorize for. So by default, it says it authorizes you for Google Cloud Platform. So again, it's not it authorizes you. You actually have application on your laptop that you want to authorize, user, you authorize in that application to use Google Cloud Platform as highlighted here on your behalf. So you launch in the app, and app does that login with Google thing, open in browser for you, and you actually authorize that app so that Google Cloud on your computer is actually like OAuth app with its own client ID, etc. And now that app has a token embedded, stored somewhere in your home directory, and it can use Cloud Platform scopes-wise. Right? So again, this is only a first step. So it needs the scopes, but it needs IAM's permission too. And I posted a link here to all the scopes available, so you can look. There is a every Google API basically lists the scopes it supports, or meaning it lists scopes that are required to access this API. And some APIs say, I don't have any like my own scopes. For example, text-to-speech API say, if you have Google Cloud Platform, I'll work with you, that's fine. But if you look, for example, at cloud storage, it would respect the cloud platform, but it has its own, fine-grained scopes. And we'll see why it was important and then and less important anymore. So with a bit of history, if you're working with GCP, for like 4 or 5 years, so back then in 2015, they had the whole IAM page, which now contains this huge list of IAM permissions, didn't exist. All we had is three basic roles called viewer, editor, and owner, right? So instead, what they did, they relied on scopes, right? So going back to our example, when you launch a VM on the certain service account, and the service account had a editor role, you want to limit this VM to not be able to do all the things that editor can do. So what you did and said, okay, I'll launch this VM, but I allow this VM to only issue itself, let's say, dev storage read-only, meaning it would only have read-only access to cloud storage, right? This is kind of the opposite situation. So the service account have editor role on the whole project, but we limiting it with the scopes, right? So it kind of goes the other way around. But of course, Google quickly recognized that it's quite kind of limiting situation, and you have like a bit of a confusion, kind of what comes first. You have like two access control systems that in a way compete with each other. So early Google services, they have these fine-grained scopes. BigQuery is another good example. If I look at BigQuery API, we can see it has lots of kind of full control, read-only, insert data, etc. scopes. But all the newest services, like I showed you with text-to-speech API, they just say cloud platform, and that's all. And they say, basically the strategy is we don't use scopes within the cloud platform as a method of access control, and we just rely on IAM. Now, the thing is, with IAM though, you need to be careful too, because not all services have IAM. So going back to our text-to-speech API, right? It doesn't have any fine-grained scopes, just cloud platform, off you go. Perfect, easy to understand. But then we go to permission page. We can see what, for example, for compute, we have all kind of permissions. So for example, if you want to create external VPN gateways, there is certain permission that your user or service account need to possess. But for example, if I look for speech here, right, there is no any permission for speech. What does it mean? If I have a VM with Google, with Cloud Platform Scope enabled, and speech API is enabled in that project, that VM can use it because there are no any IAM controls to prevent it. So you need to be careful here, and again, follow the Google philosophy that projects are your entity of cloud platform management. So because if you have like a fresh project and you launch a VM there and speech API is not enabled, so that VM wouldn't be able to enable the API and hence can't use that API. So again, the approach is you have one application, you can create a dedicated project to run or host that application and keep things isolated in that matter in such a way. Okay, so now we've seen GCP. It kind of makes sense, I hope. Now let's branch out of GCP. Let's say we want to access Google Drive. Okay, so how do they do that? we say, okay, we have a local development machine. We authorize it for Google Cloud. Now let's authorize it for our application code to use the same credentials. So instead of using CloudAuth login, I'm using CloudAuth app default login. Okay, that basically allows my Python code to use the same credentials that we've obtained through that browser kind of handshake, right? And then I run a simple Python code. Basically, what I'm saying, just take the default credentials, basically use the token that I've just created, and after that, I'll say create a service entry with those credentials and list the files. And then I'll have very strange permissions. So till here, if you didn't look at the URLs, you never saw word scopes. You kind of behind the scenes if you work just with GCP. But now if you go with this example, it will throw a traceback saying insufficient permissions. You don't have the right authentication scopes. And then think, okay, what is scopes, right? How they get to the scopes. So yeah, scopes matter, and this is why I need to understand them. So the way to get out of this error is actually run our gcloud auth app default login with explicit scope list. And then when the browser launches, okay, it will ask you, Google Cloud SDK would like to have access to Google Cloud Platform, and then it will have another line because we specified the drive here. It will say it would like to have an access to Google Drive. So again, it's application on your computer, and you are basically authorizing your own application to have access to Google Drive, okay? And then you run the same Python code, and it works. Of course, it only works if there are right permissions. So for example, if you want to access my friend's file, that file needs to be shared with me. So I have to, it's again the same two-layer system. First, you need to scope the scope to be able to talk to the drive at all, which is kind of blanket access on off. But after that, you need drive permission themselves to make sure that you succeed in doing what you're doing. Now, the next part is, if you look at the Google API, and I mention it here because you'll find lots of examples like that on Stack Overflow that people specify scopes as part of the code. This won't work without this, because this is just says, I want to use the token that I already have from here to work with particular scopes, but the authorization process doesn't happen here. It happens on the browser consent page, right? So you can put whatever scopes you like here, as long as they're a subset of what you have already pre-authorized in advance. Okay, so right, we understand the scopes now, hopefully. Let's see why they're important back to GCP. Now, the thing is that every instance of your code that runs on GCP, it runs under a certain service account. So service account is like a machine user, right? And so be it VM, GKE pod, Cloud Run, container, Cloud Function, whatever, they all have a certain user entity, which is service account associated with them. Now, because the service account is just a user, it uses the same OAuth flow, and the question comes how we control the scopes here, because it's all kind of managed for us, but it's still OAuth 2, and we need the scopes to be set up correctly, right? So historically, as I'm saying, they said, okay, let's just have a default service account to use for compute engine, right? And I have it here. So we have a compute engine service account, and please note it has an editor role. So if you just create a new VM, today still, next, it will have an editor grade access to a project. And again, historically, to combat that, they restricted what can be done by this VM by means of reducing the scopes, right? So let's see. For example, here is the wizard that creates a new VM. If I select Compute Engine default service account, default access will say you will only have read-only access to cloud storage, and you can write stack driver logs and a couple of other things. And as years go by, this list goes shorter. So like several years ago, they had a much broader list of default, scopes you had, and then they sent certain emails. Hey guys, we're reducing the default list, and 2 years from now, make sure to update your, application code to prevent breakages, right? But then I think, okay, what about Google Drive? Maybe if I, set access for each API manually, I can have a, input my Google Drive here. No, this only stuff, BigQuery, Bigtable admin, all the GCP services that have those custom scopes, but you can't put there neither Google Drive nor, let's say, a directory API, nothing like that. And then you wonder, okay, how do I do that? Maybe I don't want to use the default service account because it has editor. Maybe I can use my custom service account. Nice, but then I don't have any way to specify scopes at all, right? So I just select the service account, and that's all. And then it tells me to use AAM. So the things that happen, if you use custom service account, and it's not kind of written here anywhere, it will just launch your VM with Cloud Platform scope. And there's no way in the UI you can control that, okay? If you launch your VM with gcloud command and specify just service account, it will be launched without any scopes at all, meaning it won't be able to talk to any Google Cloud service. And I'm still not sure if it's a bug or feature. So actually, if you want to launch a VM that will run your application that should be able to talk to Google Drive, the only thing to do that is actually use gcloud command and pass both scopes list and both custom service account name. And this way you set both the service account and the scopes. But the thing is, it's fixed. You create it once, you set it once, and if you want to use the same default credentials that Google provides automatically to your VM, these scopes cannot be changed. Again, historically, this is part of the Google's way to restrict that wide editor default role to do only certain things by means of providing the more narrow scope access. Okay. Yes, and so like here you have to think in advance. So if you run on VM, you have to launch your VMs with certain scopes and kind of think what application are going to run on those VMs to ensure that they have the right scopes in advance. Now, yes, and as I said, it's on Google Cloud only. With one VM, it's kind of okay, right? You say you have just one VM, so I kind of know what I plan to run on that VM. But it becomes more of a problem with GKE, right? Because on GKE you have several nodes, and they can run hundreds of pods, each of them being a different application altogether, which can change much rapidly. Now, so unfortunately, GKE is not much different. You can have a custom service account with custom scopes, but they again are predefined. You can't change them after you launch. The only good thing is you can change them per node pool. So for example, you have a node pool, let's say, production web, and now you have a new version of the app that requires access to Google Drive. You can actually launch prod web -2 with the right scopes and then deploy your app on that new node. It's it's really unfriendly, and still all the configuration is still done through CLI, but at least you have a way. The only promising thing that I didn't have a chance to check fully is about a year ago, there's a new feature called GKE workload identity. So by default, all pods that run on the node, they use to talk to Google services, they use the same credentials that Node's service account, which can be inflexible, right? You may have to, you may end up with having lots of small node pools, each one is running with different service account, just to have that fine-grained permission control with various service accounts. So to tackle that, they introduced a new feature where you can actually take a pod and say, okay, this pod, it will not run with Node service account. It will run with its own service account, right? And this way you can have like one node running 10 pods, and each of those 10 pods having their own identities, which they will use to talk to GCP services. The only thing, I didn't have a time to check the scopes here, but if you can, have custom scopes there, it can be a good step forward. Now, moving on, what about Cloud Run and Cloud Functions, right? So Cloud Run is kind of similar. You have a container, right? Instead of launching it on GKE, you can launch it on Cloud Run. Situation here is much better. So by default, if you don't do anything, it's the same kind of dangerous place situation. If you take a container, launch it on Cloud Run with default parameters, you will end up with something that has editor role on your project, right? And there is no scopes here. You don't configure any scopes in advance for Cloud Run, which is a good thing. I'll explain in a moment. But again, you can, this is where I'm saying it's important to understand scopes, because you have application that you think is a bit secure, because let's say you can't write to cloud storage by default if you launch it on a VM, but you take the same application, the same container that you just ran on the VM, you ran the same container on Cloud Run, boom, suddenly it has access to your cloud storage and can delete your buckets, because by default it has editor grade access to your project. But of course, service account is configurable. You just run Cloud Run deploy their service account and set the service account, and you're all set. Now, the scopes, this is where it gets great. And the reason is you can just request any scopes you like as part of a process that obtains your cloud credentials, and GCE metadata server for Cloud Run will pre-authorize them for you. So in the previous example where I said this won't work out of the box on the VM, right, unless you launch a VM in a very specific way and you list the scopes explicitly during VM launch configuration command. On Cloud Run, this will just work. So again, this is another point where you take the same code, right? You wrap it in the container. If you launch in the container of VM, it won't work. Exactly the same container image. You launch it on Cloud Run, no problem at all. Similar to Cloud Functions, they use App Engine default service account, which is again has editor role on your project, and but again, you can use custom service account and scopes kind of being pre-authorized for you on the fly by Google metadata server. And the last but not least is App Engine, which is oldest of all and less lucky of all. So being 13 years old this year, this thing, it has default service account, which this default is not configurable, and the scopes are not configurable either. So in a given project, all your App Engine services will use the same service account with one fixed scope, which is quite problematic, because you can't have like fine-grained permission. You can't have like front-end service and back-end service having different permissions, right? Because they use the same service account. If you want to have a service that talks to Google Drive, and you want to run it in an App Engine, you have to have apply some interesting tricks to make it happen, to kind of allow the service account to recreate tokens for itself, and then you can reassign your credentials with new tokens, etc. And if this is something you're interested in, I leave in the references here that describe all those matters and details and provide more elaborated examples. So if you do encounter these problems, I highly suggest you read this.